Good evening this evening, and welcome to Woman Space's Focus on Women. I am Florence Rapoport, Director Emerita of Woman Space, which is, as you probably know, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to serving the needs of today's women, whatever those needs may be. This program, Focus on Women, is presenting conversations with women of interest, women famous and not so famous, women of high achievement, women of special circumstances or special problems, women in the workforce, or women at home, but all women with something to say. If you or someone you know has something special that you think might be of interest to our audience, I would be happy to hear from you. You can reach me, Florence Rapoport, care of Woman Space, 3 St. Paul's Place, Great Neck, New York, 11021. And that brings us to tonight's guest, Ms. Amy Bloom, writer and psychotherapist whose first book, Come to Me, is a collection of stories that probe the human heart of the characters in the book and of the readers of the book. Wonderful. She writes, in the words of Ursula K. Le Guin, quote, about the young, the old, the mad, the sane, Jews, Catholics, whites, blacks, men, women, furriers, musicians, doctors, young mothers, people dying, people living. Oh, does she ever write about people living, says Ursula Le Guin. And the point of view shifts are endlessly fascinating, the voices in perfect tune. She can handle unspeakable pain with the quiet authority of a Chekhov, not a bad comparison.
I'm happy.
But has an even rarer gift. She describes happiness in such a way that we can share it. This is a book of love. Close quote, to which I add my sentiments exactly. I thought everything about the book was astounding. It should be noted that 2 of these stories were selected before this book came out for inclusion in Best American Short Stories in 1991 and 1992. It honors our program for her to be here, and it is with great pleasure and pride that I welcome Amy Bloom.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, it's good of you to come.
It's always nice to come back to greatness.
Coming home, right? I haven't told everybody yet that. Okay, Ms. Bloom. Soon I'll call you Amy, but first a little formality. I'm always interested in the path by which writers come to their work. How early on did you begin to write or begin to feel like a writer? Your path, I know, was more interesting than most. Why don't we start with when you started to write?
I wrote a lot when I was a little kid. I mean, I read and I wrote. I read The Scarlet Pimpernel, and so I wrote Adventures of the Scarlet Pimpernel, except they happened to be taking place in the form of a little 8-year-old girl instead of a, aristocrat during the French Revolution, things like that.
Oh,
and,
nice. So you were so you've always been writing?
Yes. I didn't think of myself as a writer until I signed a contract for the books.
Okay, but for a while you didn't write at all, right?
Not at all. I mean, I didn't write at all between 16 and 35.
You said something interesting in some preface or someplace that you could barely live your life, much less write about it.
It was a little overwhelming.
It was,
and I think
being 16.
Being 16 was a little overwhelming, and then I got caught up in other things.
Okay, so you graduated from high school, and now I think I should tell the audience that Amy Bloom, famous writer, as of tomorrow,
right,
and wonderful book as of today, and wonderful stories as of yesterday. Amy Bloom went to Great Neck North Senior High. Unluckily for me, she was never in my class, although I got pretty close with her sister, right? Ellen was in my class. And for her to come back to make this opportunity to be interviewed for your pleasure and my pride is something I'm very grateful for. Okay, so when you graduated from high school, you left Great Neck?
Promptly.
Promptly.
The day after graduation, as a matter of fact.
Really?
Yes, we got in a car with 2 of my classmates, and we drove to Canada, and then we drove down the West Coast, and then they dropped me off in Ohio so I could go travel with my then boyfriend, who had gotten a grant to study organic agriculture.
So then you were in what state?
Oh, we were everywhere, but we broke down in Texas.
In Texas, okay. And you got married?
Well, no, we pretended to get married.
Oh, you pretended to be married?
No, we didn't get really married. We pretended to get married. So we went to Woolworths, and we bought, for like $5, you could get 2 little gold wedding bands, and we put it on to protect the sensibilities of all the ladies and gentlemen that we thought we would be encountering in the farm towns. And I don't know that we fooled them. I don't know that they care. You know, what's it to them?
Well, what's it to them in the current sensibility, one can say lightly, but what year was that, Amy?
1970?
70.
71? Around
70, 71 was a little early on
yes,
for
well, we thought it was a good idea.
liberated women.
Yeah, we thought it was a good idea. And I'm sure that people thought we were a bad match, but obviously destined to spend our lives together. But it was not
So
the
there
case.
you were with these fake wedding real wedding bands, but representing
On fake hands, right?
On fake hands, a fake marriage. And your camper broke down.
Oh, yes, it broke down in Deaf Smith County, which is where they make the best peanut butter in America, which they still do.
For which you picked the peanuts.
Yeah, so we could get the truck fixed.
Oh, God. Okay, so then you picked peanuts, and so everything is going pretty nicely. You're doing
Except for the
interesting
relationship,
things.
which is down the tubes.
So then that broke up.
So we break up in Albuquerque.
That was sad. So now you're out
It was sort of sad.
in Texas alone, on your own.
Yes.
And what do? You rush home?
No, I never rush home. I am actually, I think it's still true now, but especially then, I was never unhappy to be on my own and away from home and seeing what came next. I still don't mind, but I didn't mind at all then.
You realize that you are a product of your time. I hope you credit your times a little bit with that. You know,
Sure.
it was permissible to be an independent young woman just out of high school. For me, I went to a subway college
Right.
because the thought of being not at home was so scary. But that was in 1940, so 1970 was already an.
Oh yes, it was. No,
new
I'm
time.
actually delighted to have grown up exactly when I grew up. It was a time that was very well suited for me. So that worked out just dandy.
Wonderful,
And I
yeah.
arranged a job in Boston by mail, and stood in the Albuquerque post office and sent out a job application and sent out my application to BU for the following year because BU didn't require an essay, and that seemed just like the right application form for me
Because you're such a
because I'm lazy.
You're so incapable of writing and lazy. Okay, so obviously you weren't enamored of formal education, but you saw that maybe it would be.
But it beat the hell out of menial labor, yeah.
It beat the hell out of menial labor. I think that's good. So Boston had the wisdom to accept you, and you came east. You
I
went
came
to college.
east. Well, I worked for about a year before I went to college and sort of did odds and ends and got jobs, lost jobs, kind of faked my way through a couple of jobs, which was pretty good. And then I started at BU, which seemed much nicer than working for a living.
Good.
And then I transferred to Wesleyan, where I finished up.
Did you major in English?
No, I majored in theater and government.
Oh, theater and government. That was covering every possible base, right?
I thought I'd be prepared for the future.
So you did some theater work, right? You worked with kids, you put on plays, you did stuff like
Right.
that.
I acted and I directed, and I was a much better director than I was an actress or an actor.
Actor, yeah, we're
And,
into non-diminutives.
Right. An actette, whatever it is.
Right. Okay, so then you got married again.
I got married for the first time.
Oh, for the first time. Right. You see, you got me
I
fooled.
know.
My
My husband would be
sensibility.
very surprised to hear this. No, we got married for the first time in my parents' backyard in Great Neck in 1977.
Oh, wonderful. And you've been married ever since.
Ever since, every day.
I
so
think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's good
I
too.
think that's wonderful. Okay, so then you went to graduate school.
Yep.
Reason for that?
Well, I guess people always told me their secrets and their stories and wanted to talk to me about it. I think I have actually that kind of nice, open, friendly face.
Attentive man. Attentive.
Attentive.
Most people don't listen when other people talk.
Yeah, so I pay attention. And well, I thought, well, this seemed like a reasonable way to make a living. And so I went to graduate school at Smith, which had a program in clinical social work that focused on psychotherapy, which was definitely what I wanted to do. And went to graduate school, came back, got a job, quit after 5 months because I didn't like being told what to do, and because my boss was crazy. And I was pregnant, and then I had Caitlin, and then I went back to work and quit that job after 9 months for more of the same reasons, and also because I had started private practice by then, and that was going pretty well.
Okay, so your life at that point includes being married, being a clinical
Social worker.
with a focus on psychotherapy,
Mm-hmm.
and having a few kids.
A few kids,
Three,
actually.
to be exact. Okay, but then all this time writing was not in your head as my life's work or anything, right?
No, I felt that I was doing my life's
You were
work.
doing your life's work. In fact, you were living your life.
And I was, trying to catch up on my sleep. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
sort of my life.
Okay, so what happened? Interesting little story. Tell us.
Oh, I have been doing the practice for quite some time, and I was doing a lot of teaching and supervising, which I really enjoyed. And I thought, well, maybe I want to become an analyst. A lot of my friends were psychoanalysts. It was a process that I found very interesting. A lot of good writing came out of it. So I went for my appointment in New Haven with the guy who I wanted to become my analyst, and then he would be my training analyst, and then I would go through the institute, and after 15 years I'd be an analyst. And we had this
and
great,
you'd understand yourself, maybe.
right, or yes, or at least be able to act as though I understood myself and
Right.
have a better handle on other people. So we had a wonderful time and a great chat, and I was driving back, and pages of plot came to me for a story.
Pushed up out of your
I think pushed up out of definitely pushed up out of my unconscious, because I was driving and I was writing the notes down on a napkin next to me, because I felt sort of like a woman in sort of an old-fashioned melodrama, was sort of like, that I was being spoken to. I mean, it was sort of like, okay, wait. And so I wrote it down and
amazing.
got home and I went, oh, apparently I am not going to be an analyst. Apparently there are some stories that I want to write. And so I let the psychoanalyst know, and he sent me back a lovely note, very, very generous and very giving in a
He
very
was looking
parental
forward
way.
to working with you, obviously.
Yes, he had. He said that he understood this was obviously something I needed to do, and if he was still alive at some future point when I decided I want to become an analyst, I should just give him a call. But I haven't called him.
Good. But you wrote about
Yes.
a version of him in
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
Are you still? Is he still alive?
As far as I know, still alive, still being a terrific analyst.
You want to send him a copy of the book?
I should send him a copy of the book. That's true.
And the audience, you'll know why in a little bit when we talk about the stories. Okay, so Amy, we're down to Amy. Where do your stories come from? They all spring full-blown from your subconscious?
I guess they all come from my unconscious. I mean, they come from my encounters with people. They don't come from my practice. They don't come from my clients. But there's a big world out there, and you encounter lots of people, and your friends and your family and people on the street, and then in all those people who sort of people your imagination, who just kind of show up unbidden.
Amazing. Listen, at some risk, I will say the following thing to you. I'm big on believing in the autobiographical content of all writing, and particularly of first novels or first books. So I kept looking in your story for things. Tell me how you respond to that.
Well, I guess when people ask me that, which is not uncommon, I always sort of say, well, in which story do you see me? Is it in the story told from the point of view of a man who grows up in Canada and then moves to Minnesota and becomes a psychiatrist? Or is it in the girl with the schizophrenic sister? Or is it with the half-Italian woman who's married to a black jazz musician? I mean, which story do you see me in?
Okay, I think I have to yield on that, and I'm going to have to think this through a little bit, because your gift for understanding people is so great, is so profound, that it all seems as if you must have lived it. But it is this, what you said, this fictive imagination that puts things together. So in a way, your life and the people in your life become the raw material, but the fictionalizing, the embroidering, the specifics are all imagined.
Yes, I guess what's important is that the fiction should be true to something. I don't know that it matters that it's true to the facts,
Right, true to some understanding of.
Right.
And what are facts, anyhow?
They don't matter a whole lot to me.
The merest sticks of which things are built. Okay, so now let's talk about the stories, okay?
Okay, let's talk about the stories, not the writer.
You mentioned the story with the sister, with this.
Right.
Well, we won't say what happens to her before we talk a little bit about this story. Right. Rose and Violet, who are part of this group of stories that sort of have a connecting thread.
Yes.
They are, in fact, the children of that boy who grew up in Manitoba
Yes.
and was taken to Duluth. We'll talk about that story later. Just talk about the sisters for a minute, Rose and Violet.
Well, I think if there is an autobiographical element, an intimate and affectionate relationship between two sisters is certainly something that I bring from my life.
But I worried about your sisters.
I know when people read Silver Water, they go, I know just how you feel. This happened to my sister, this happened to my brother. And sometimes I feel like a fraud because my sister, thank God, is alive and well in Westport. And, you know.
I'm happy to hear that,
right,
you know, because there is that nervous identification
right.
that made me very genuinely concerned,
right.
you know. So
no.
Ellen is wonderful and
yes,
fine.
and she always says to people, tell them I am fine. And she is, you know. She's smart and beautiful and happily married and a good lawyer and has a lovely daughter and not at all like the story.
She was a big favorite of mine. I'm so happy to hear this. Yes. Okay. So tell me what happens to those two sisters.
Well, in the story, I mean, I think it really is a story about love, and there are things that people cannot overcome. You know, there are illnesses that are intractable. And I guess having spent a fair amount of time in psychiatric hospitals, you see some of that sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes you see wonderful turnarounds, and sometimes you see people who cannot recover. And I guess the story came out of what I experienced about families, just devastation and the terrible pain and sort of the fragmentation of their lives in every way.
And your title, Silver Water, refers to the fact that to the situation in which her beautiful, beautiful voice was described in that way as crystal. Yes. Crystal silver or something like that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there is a quality to certain kinds of operatic sopranos that just always has knocked me out.
Is that it is crystalline?
Yeah, it's just very bright. And, you know, often with people who are very mentally ill, there's just, you see the person that they have been, you see the person who is still in there, and it's just that much more painful because they're down this long corridor that you can't get to.
And she never comes back.
No, she doesn't come back.
Well, I should hasten to tell the audience that's about as sad as the book gets. There are so many wonderful, unsad things. Let's talk quickly about the other sisters in what was the best short story of 1991, right? Love is Not a Pie.
Love is Not a Pie, yeah.
Love is Not a Pie. Okay, again, this situation of two loving, devoted sisters in a loving, devoted family with a somewhat antic look at love, right?
Yes, I call it my adult fairy tale. I think that all of us would like to think, often would like to think, that it might be possible to have everything that one wants, that you don't always have to close one door when you open another, that you don't always have to make choices.
Like the existential philosophy, which says every time you make a choice, you die a little, because you shut off all the other possibilities.
Absolutely. And I think that people actually do experience that. And I guess the story is sort of my effort to say, wouldn't it be lovely if that weren't so? If one could just sort of keep on opening doors.
Yeah, but so why did she have to die?
Oh, well, because...
She who experienced this multiplicity of love and all.
Well, that was unfortunate.
That was unfortunate. Maybe we could rewrite it. Okay.
And in the next story, she was just kidding. She was really fine. She just wanted her daughters to learn something.
Oh, good.
Right.
Good. Listen, I'm the kid who, when I was, I don't know, a young kid going to the movies, always checked to make sure a film had a happy ending, a movie, before I went to it. You know, I couldn't bear it to be otherwise. Okay, so we just rewrote the end of that story.
It'll be much
Or,
and my younger daughter will like it much better because she does not like unhappy endings.
Oh, so I'm still a... I love being class with your younger daughter, right? These two juvenile minds. Okay. Talk a little bit about life breaks where no sun shines.
Oh, well, I guess one of the first things that strikes me about light breaks is that it's one of the few stories that's actually physically located in Great Neck.
I know you refer to Baker Hill Road.
Baker Hill, and there's my old elementary school, which was Arundel,
Mm-hmm.
and the Furrier Shop in Middle Neck Road. And I'm not exactly sure why that was, but it was very clear to me that this was the right suburban location for that
For this
story.
The
And
characters totally imagined.
characters and situations, all the events are totally imagined, but the setting was definitely Great Neck, and certainly came out of memories that I had of missing the school bus at Arundel and walking home, and just going through miles and miles of beautiful green lawn, which I would sort of walk on and then get on the road in case anybody saw me walking on the lawn, but then I'd get back on the lawn because it was so great to walk through these beautiful spreads of turf.
Because Great Neck is a beautiful town.
It
It's
is.
a beautiful town. And your memory of it, the immortalizing of it in that story is really wonderful. And of course, the comment that all people, I guess, can take to heart, what happens in the story between Mr. Klein, the furrier, and Susan, the little girl who is not too happy at home, whose parents are not too appreciative of her, is very touching. I don't think we should say anything else about that, right?
Well, it's also a story about love.
It's a story about love, and it's love with an edge. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Trust me. Okay, now this is the last really sad story we're going to talk about, and that's When the Year Grows Old. Another breakdown of sorts. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, the root of that story was not a sad one. I was downstairs in the basement of my house riding my exercycle, as I attempt to do on a regular basis, and everybody in my family came down to talk to me. My husband had something he needed to check with me. One of the kids had something they needed to check with me. Another kid had something she needed to check with me. And then there was a phone call. And I was just beside myself. I thought, I'll just live down here. I will just finish doing what I need to do. I need to be on this exercycle for 35 minutes. I need 35 minutes of peace and quiet. And that's actually how the story started. But then it sort of, and that's where the lady in the basement came from. But I think it also developed again out of a sense that often, even in very painful family situations, there are no villains. And although the father in that story is not the most attractive character, I don't feel unsympathetic towards him.
He comes dangerously close to being hateful.
Yeah, he's not attractive.
But then when you realize what he is dealing with in terms of this,
Yes, he is attempting to save himself. And when people do that, they often kick somebody else in the teeth,
Yeah.
as you are sort of desperately trying to climb onto the lifeboat.
but then, at the very end, well, I don't want to, I won't say this, but it's an incredibly haunting story. Some of the stories are powerful, some of the stories are hilarious. All of them are wonderful. This one is haunting, especially the last paragraph. Okay, now we come to a very cheerful story,
Okay.
the one that we think your almost training analyst should read. Psychoanalysis changed my life. By arriving at understanding? No, tell us quickly.
By breaking all the rules about being a psychoanalyst.
And interfering in your patients'
Interfering in
lives.
people's lives, telling them what to do and how to live, and arranging for their future happiness. It is, it's probably the story I had the most fun with.
It's an incredibly charming story, and very unexpected. Things keep happening that, oh, and then, of course, the wonderful happy ending and that incredible analogy to Noah. Do you remember the line? I have it someplace here.
I have it somewhere in the back of my head.
As awestruck?
And grateful as Noah, right?
Right. Knowing that he had been selected for survival. Noah of the flood, right?
Right.
And the arrival of doves.
Yeah.
Somebody had been saved from whatever his life was in the way that Noah had been saved. That was so wonderful, wonderful. Okay, we're getting short on time. I want you just quickly to talk about this story, which is the most intensely complex mixture of sadness and love and joy. Semper Fidelis. Always faithful, right?
Always faithful. And I guess part of it is that I think that people who love each other are always faithful. It's not clear to me that that always takes the form of monogamy or sexual exclusivity or reassuring pats on the hand.
Good.
This is really about two people who love each other very much, who enter into a relationship knowing that it will end. And in fact, the end is unexpected to both of them.
Sooner than they expected.
Sooner, and not how they thought it would be. But they were both prepared to take that risk because the time together was valuable and the ending is valuable for them.
All right, I'm going to say a little more about the story,
All
right?
right.
This is an 18-year-old girl who marries a 50-year-old man, and people tell her she doesn't have to, she can get away from it, she can give him up, whatever, whatever. And she says, I want to marry him, I love him. Well, that's already uncharted territory somehow, really very unusual. And then the next thing that happens is, and this isn't giving too much away, he's dying of cancer. And how she lives her life and answers his needs and merges the joy of their love into the end of his life. Ellen, Amy, it was wonderful. It was unbelievably wonderful. Okay,
Thank
so
you.
as you can gather, I think these stories were wonderful. I'm at a loss for vocabulary for the words. I just want to say one other quick thing about Malcolm Keith, to whom you give acknowledgement in the book. I was surprised and delighted to see that. He was among my favorite colleagues in the English faculty at Great Neck Schools, and a wonderful person. Obviously, he contributed happily to your writing.
A good reader and a good
A
critic.
good reader and a good
And a good
critic.
friend.
And a good man. And a good man. Yeah. Well, I hope he's very proud now, as indeed he should be. Okay, so I did want to ask you my standard feminist question. How do you manage all your careers, 2 careers and a husband and 3 kids?
Well, I don't get as much sleep as I would like. I think it's sort of the obvious answer for everybody. I think that I make choices about things, and they're not always, I mean, it doesn't mean that everything gets done. What it means is that the first thing that suffers is my writing, and the second thing is my husband, and I do my best to protect the kids, and maybe my practice might suffer once in a while. The kids, I think, don't.
Prime.
Yeah, the kids don't get it, but everything else, you know,
Gives when it has to.
Gives when it has to.
Amy, that is one of the essential messages in your book. The kids are prime. The
It's
kids
true.
are prime. Every single family where there are problems and whatever, you get a feeling of the lack of love or time for kids. Amy Bloom, writer extraordinaire, I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. This was lovely. Thank
And
you.
I want the audience to, I want to thank you for being there, but I want you to know that I realize how you've been rewarded by seeing and hearing and listening to Amy Bloom. And her wonderful book, Come to Me, is the title. Anyone who misses reading it will miss an experience in life. Amy, thank you for being here. Dear audience, thank you for being there. This is Florence Rapoport saying good night this night and looking forward to seeing you on our next night. Good evening this evening, and welcome to Woman Space's Focus on Women. I am Florence Rapoport, Director Emerita of Woman Space, which is, as you probably know, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to serving the needs of today's women, whatever those needs may be. This program, Focus on Women, is presenting conversations with women of interest, women famous and not so famous, women of high achievement, women of special circumstances or special problems, women in the workforce, or women at home, but all women with something to say. If you or someone you know has something special that you think might be of interest to our audience, I would be happy to hear from you. You can reach me, Florence Rapoport, care of Woman Space, 3 St. Paul's Place, Great Neck, New York, 11021. And that brings us to tonight's guest, Ms. Beverly Coyle, writer and professor of English literature at Vassar College. Her first fictional work, The Kneeling Bus, was widely acclaimed by critics across the country. A fine new talent, reported the Kirkus Reviews, the prestigious Kirkus Reviews. And, quote, a gracefully written first novel, said the New Yorker. The New York Times Book Review claimed, quote, when you're finished, you want to do it all over again. That's the best reaction to a book you could have, right? And Andy Solomon, writing in the St. Petersburg Times, said, quote, this warm and wise novel completely charms us long before we feel how much it has taught us. Another wonderful thing to have said about a book. Her 2 earlier works were literary studies of Wallace Stevens, the poet, and her just-published novel, In Troubled Waters, a bold novel of the contemporary South, is a story of love and family, illness and compassion, set against the backdrop of the latent racism that lies beneath the veneer of polite society. Powerful. A 5th-generation Floridian, Ms. Coyle intertwines history and memory with a strong story of the moment and illuminates what may be the major social issue of our time. Comparisons to Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor seem as appropriate and justified as they are impressive. It is with great pride and high expectations that I welcome Ms. Beverly Coyle.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. We really appreciate that. Ms. Coyle, I'm always interested in the early influences and motivating experiences that lead people into whatever paths their lives take. Would you tell us a little bit about your early life and the sources of your interest in writing, since that's how I think of you now, as a writer of wonderful books?
Well, you mentioned the South. You can't be from the South without it being an enormous influence as a young person. Probably something I didn't realize until I had left and ended up in the exotic Northeast and discovered how exotic coming from Florida is for people. Always found myself saying 5th generation. This means my mother born there, my grandfather and my great-grandparents, and before that by 1 more generation.
That is unbelievable.
It is. There was a pioneer spirit, and I, of course, grew up hearing about it from my grandparents, particularly my grandfather. They're very proud of that. And but as far as writing goes, I think of the anecdotal quality of being from the South. You got points if you could sit at the table and keep your grandfather's attention for 45 seconds by telling an interesting story.
Really?
Mostly the older people of the family were the ones who spoke, and I remember listening at the wit and turn of phrase of those people, and loving to be able to tell a story.
Isn't that interesting?
I didn't write all that much as a child or as even a college student, not fiction anyway.
Mostly it was the telling of stories,
I think so.
right? Like an oral tradition almost. That's so interesting. Beverly, may I call you Beverly?
Yes, please.
Young
yes,
person.
Florence.
Beverly. Oh, good. Florence, good. Sometimes I've wondered about the plethora of Southern writers.
Yes.
Seems to be more than most regional sources, and that what you say is the explanation, that valued tradition.
Certainly it was for us. A little bit pre-television. I was 13 by the time we had. I feel blessed with that accident.
Yes, right.
But it's a mystery. A lot of people don't see Florida as the South, and so I'm probably a bit defensive in quickly saying how Southern it is. At the same time, it's a vastly changing place, and that engages me as a writer. The fact that we were so influenced by Northern people, the influx of people constantly.
Yeah, Florida is a unique place. I mean, what it was and what it is and how it got to be that way is dramatic.
Yes.
So
one of the oldest states and one of the youngest states.
One of the oldest and one of the young. Exactly right. And all of that is felt in your book, which we're going to talk about in Troubled Waters. But first we have to get to that.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
So in high school and college, did you do any writing? Were you?
Well, certainly I did. I was headed for college and headed for an English major, which sounds so classically American to talk about your major. But I thought about that as a young person wanting to study literature, and ended up going to graduate school more because of kind of a talent with writing traditional academic criticism. I was very serious about poetry and literary theory. And it was this pre-feminist theory, I might say. I mean, it was starting to happen.
Yeah, but it was not yet.
But it was more what we call new criticism. And I was very good at it. I went off to graduate school. I ended up with a fairly traditional PhD in American literature / Wallace Stevens, and wanted to teach. Was really what I wanted to do.
You wanted to, okay.
I didn't see myself as a fiction writer at that time.
Listen, that English major makes us sisters, right? And teaching too. That was my college and graduate school
I knew you had
work.
taught. I didn't realize it was English.
And I taught for 25 years, and I taught English literature, and I taught Wallace Stevens among American writers. So, that thesis then became the book that you wrote?
My first book on Stevens grew out of several years study at the graduate level. I didn't really write my book on Stevens till I was at Vassar, almost.
Teaching.
Yes, quite a bit later, but I did begin with the thesis on Stevens that I was able eventually to rewrite almost completely, but
the basis was there.
The basis was there, and I think certainly you begin with a major figure at that point and stick with it, probably to get your first book out. You better have started.
You better have started
back then. Not everyone. But that was my
Well, not
experience.
everyone gets to the book either.
True.
So you did both very well.
I enjoyed that.
And then you served the memory of Wallace Stevens very well in your second book. Tell us quickly about that.
Well, just that his daughter had edited his letters beautifully, but I ran across a cache of letters that had been written to him, and putting the older man's letters, Stevens' letters, at a late part of his life, written in response to and in correspondence with a young 24-year-old Cuban aristocrat who had studied in this country. His English was perfect, and he wanted to translate all the American poets into Spanish, and this ended up a 10-year correspondence till Stevens died. So sort of letters to a young
You found
man.
that here on Long Island, right?
No.
That cache of letters?
No, at the Huntington Library in California.
Oh, you said Huntington, and I assumed it was our Huntington.
No,
the
it's
Huntington Library in California.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so there you are doing all this literary stuff, and
What happens then?
well, then the next thing we hear about you publishing the Kneeling Bus.
Well, certainly no one had heard about me until then.
Yeah.
I, as I say, got out of graduate school at probably the requisite age. I was in my late 20s. I taught a little bit in Australia with my first husband because we were young graduate school students who needed jobs, and he turned up a job in Australia, and I went with him and ended up teaching at the University of Newcastle above Sydney. It's about 100 miles above Sydney. Came back, got a job at Vassar, and really began trying to get tenure with my Wallace Stevens industry. One has to do that, publishing those books, but was given a creative writing class. And suddenly I was the teacher of a creative writing class. I had never done any creative writing myself. I was quite sure I could teach it, but it was really the act of making those assignments, finding out what young people at that stage and what they were writing about. Suddenly I wanted to write myself, and really began writing along with my students. And
God works in wondrous ways. God, she works in wondrous ways.
She does.
And out came The Kneeling Bus, which I understand is now out in paperback.
Yes.
So all of us who missed it, I among them, will have an opportunity to read it. And it's
Yes.
about a young girl's developmental experiences.
They're very autobiographical stories of growing up in Florida in the 50s. Florida in the 50s, in the small towns where we were, many of those towns are now considered the Gold Coast. Boynton Beach.
Boynton Beach. I spent 2 weeks in Boynton Beach this month.
You probably wouldn't have recognized our Boynton Beach.
No.
There was certainly a beginning of the retirement and
Yeah.
lovely homes. We were kind of connected with rural people and vegetables,
Mm.
orchid growers.
Well, you certainly do great honor to Florida in your work, especially in the work that I read so closely and with such great pleasure in Troubled Waters.
I'm glad
Now we
to
want
hear
to talk about that, okay?
Fine, fine.
What I thought was so particularly wonderful about it was the blending of the personal stories of individuals, fictional, although based on real people, with the history of the place. I mean, a history that has great implications for us today. I thought of it as, it made me think of Dickens, if you don't mind the comparison.
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
You know, the way the French Revolution came alive in Tale of Two Cities, and yet the characters were all fiction. I mean, Lucy and Charles Darnay. That was the feeling I got from your book. These modern people of all ages against the backdrop of 5 generations of Florida history, which took us back to what, the turn of the century, right?
Yes, I tried to allude to the freeze of 1895 because that's what I grew up hearing about. The freeze was when
crops were killed.
My grandfather was 4 at the time, and it was a big freeze that had wiped out the industry started by the Yankees. That's what we called Northerners.
These entrepreneurs.
They were the beginning of the citrus industry, and when they were wiped out that year, my great-grandfather kind of came into his own because he was too poor to leave, and he actually moved into some of the homes that were left, started the citrus business again. I didn't really get a lot of that in my book. It was too frightening for me to think of writing a historical book per se. I wanted to write about my mother and father now.
Yeah, that
and my grandfather in his very old age. He lived to be 99, still telling about the freeze. I make him 91 in the book to make him...
Tom Glover.
He's Tom Glover.
Old Tom Glover is based on your grandfather.
Yes.
Grandfather.
I began writing that book because of an image I had after a visit home in which he was now living with my parents for his last years, still very witty and completely there for every moment. And he had begun to babysit my father, who has Alzheimer's disease. And this was the early stages. My father really needed babysitters because he could move about, but he might wander off. So the image of a very old man with his memory completely intact, babysitting a man 20 years younger without a memory, and then thinking of Florida being a place whose memory is very fragile as a state.
Because it has changed so much. People aren't left to remember. Well, you've made a fabulous contribution to the past of Florida in your book. And Tom Glover, your grandfather character, is wonderful. Amazing man. I mean, that steely will and sharp, sharp mind, and the fragility of his body. They call him what, the spider? Explain the image.
Well, I actually began calling him that. I have the great-grandson, who's only 9 in the book, calls his grandfather the spider. My grandfather was pretty terrifying to young children, so as a young person I was very afraid of him, and I imagined myself into the mind of a 9-year-old. It wasn't hard for me to do, calling him spider. At one point my grandfather was on 2 canes, way out in front, and very tiny arms, and so it looked like he was 8-legged or 6-legged. The two arms and the 2 canes, and he looked like a daddy longlegs creeping out to the orange groves to sit in his chairs for his little exercise, and I started calling him that. But we were very close friends, and a lot of the intimacy, his little diaper that he makes for himself
Based on fact.
is based on his being quite proud of that. He was very much a conservationist. He didn't want to have to
Disposable.
if he didn't have to, and so he had this little contraption. He was into contraptions. You mentioned to me earlier that you picked that up in the book, that my grandfather was constantly talking about Florida's history, the farming industry, which he was very much involved in, being a history of slow development of kind of
One contraption.
weird crop devices. But yes, many of the details of the book are based on.
I always say when I teach any book about how every book is autobiographical, but in more or less disguised ways and in more or less embellished and enriched ways, right? There's also the fictive imagination at work.
Yes, once you're standing kind of on the solid rock of people you know, which is how I feel about what autobiography feels like to me. I feel confident that these people really are alive and that their histories are real, and I'm not having to reach very far and make up things having to do with, which would be simply too nuanced to make up. Then once you do that, if you want to have a kid who's a sperm bank kid, which I did in the novel.
The ultimate modernity, right?
That, yes, the ultimate contraption of the book is Petey.
Right.
That was made up and kind of based on things I read about, friends who have children. Fiction begins to surround
and enrich the memory. But I loved your saying that the actual experiences were sort of like a solid rock, standing on granite, I think you said, right? That gave you the feeling that this was real and this was true, and what you did with it then had its basis in reality.
I might have been able to write, say, about Alzheimer's disease without much firsthand experience. I mean, writers, like actors, I think, can go out and look very closely and start, with some experience, start to be able to build that foundation from just observation. But certainly when your father has the disease,
you learn a lot.
And you're a fiction writer, it kicks in. What am I going to do with this? You feel, sometimes you feel a little bit parasitic.
And what you did with the Alzheimer's was so wonderful, so touching and painful, and at the same time affirmative and a learning experience for everybody.
Our whole family is involved in this disease. You can't help but be. Even though my sisters and I are removed by thousands of miles, calling up my mother on the phone, getting some of the details, being home a lot, watching, some reading, certainly, steeping yourself a little bit in what is going on nationally with the disease. I think the book is going to be helpful for people who are sitting at home with various. I didn't set out to do that. I just thought the idea of memory on this disease level leading me into a more philosophical kind of thinking about what the memory is.
That history, in fact, is memory.
Yes.
And the past
and those of us working very closely with a man or a woman in your family who's had the memory wiped out, you can't help but begin thinking what it means to have a memory. It's quite astonishing.
It is astonishing. And I must tell you, Beverly, I've often wondered in these kind of dementia diseases, does the person know that he's not remembering? You know what I mean? It was like hard for me to understand.
Oh, in the early stages, yes.
But in the book, you make it so clear and so, I don't know, as you say, helpful of understanding to know how it works.
Well, I picked a stage. I couldn't do all the stages of the disease. I sort of picked one of the stages that my father was in which my grandfather was most involved and most interested in what was happening to this person, and would say quite amazing things that I would write down in my notebook. One time I was home and my grandfather, just almost with tears in his eyes, he was stern, and he says, your father has nothing left of him except just how fine a man he is.
That's in the book.
And I just wrote that down.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Because he saw so the disease can be, for the people around the victim, a poetically illuminating thing. As tragic as it is, you begin to think about what makes up character and what takes it away, which eventually the disease does.
And all of that is the nature and essence of your book. The
It's the
disease
situation.
is part. It's the situation, right? The situation, and of
Plot
course,
was something else.
plot was something else, right? Which you had to create. But that essential reality of somebody's lost memory and this old man, 90-something.
And my mother, 76, and heroic people in their latter stages.
Your mother, of course, is the lowest character in the book.
Yes.
I thought she was amazing, from so timid and so intimidated by life and so burdened and so unloved and unappreciated really. She emerges as the strong one, the clear one, the forceful one. She was wonderful.
This is what happens, doesn't it, with women?
Yeah.
So much of the time.
Until strengths come out.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so the Alzheimer's, and we're not going to say any more about it because it's something that people need to read. I just do want to mention your combination treatment of the support group reality of our time, the negatives and the positives and the hilarity in some ways. It was really very wonderful wonderful writing. And of course, with the grandfather, 90-something years old, who lived through the incident at Little Town, a black ghetto where terrible things happened. You have that background. Oh, and your grandfather does mention he was once in the Klan, right?
Yes.
Briefly.
My grandfather had a kind of fictional way of handling that. I mean, I'm sure the Klan in Central Florida would have been very, very big in the 20s. There are reasons we could go into for why it kind of flourished. And so we would try to get him to talk about the Klan, and he knew that he had to kind of have a fictional version of it. So much of what I say about his involvement in the Klan in the book, I've had to kind of surmise. Because he wasn't as open, for reasons that you can imagine,
Obviously.
what was going on. I will tell you this, though. He did admit, and this again was a way of maybe softening his activity, that the Klan in the 20s was about bootlegging. This might be interesting to audiences, that in fact, with the hood on, a white man could destroy another white man, still a competitor, in the name of law and order, and he found that pretty disgusting, the vendetta element of the Klan at that time. Now, it kind of made a comic story because, of course, he was suggesting that he didn't want to have anything to do with that.
Right.
Presumably, the other things that the Klan did, maybe he was
were more legitimate in a way than hurting another one.
Some of those things I couldn't put in the book.
Put in the book. But you use that past memory to illuminate
What's
the issue
happening
of
now.
racism today in a suburban town, which is Point Breeze. You know, now it's outside
Central
of Orlando.
Florida.
Central Florida, outside of Orlando. Many professionals, many upwardly mobile young families, and one black family with a wonderful son who parallels Lucky Apple, the younger past black boy
friend
who
of the
came
old
to
man.
such a tragic end and was a friend of the old man. It's wonderful, and the way you deal with all this, a slight element of mystery, a little reference, a hint of something that makes the close reader eager to find out more. You know what I mean? It just draws you to develop.
To some extent, that's true for the writer.
And the writer,
I wonder what's going to happen now, is an
Wonderful.
experience that the writer sometimes has as you
Wonderful.
get convinced that your characters are real, and now almost anything can happen, is a stage of a writing that's very exciting.
that is exciting. As long as you're standing on that granite base, right?
I think so. If
That
you can
you
get
said.
your characters rounded enough to be real, then
Yeah.
the issues that they face, which began as an issue of loss of memory and tragedy, and then gradually for me, I realized that I not really wanted to as a writer.
Needed.
It just began coming out. Glover's past. What past did he have? I made up part of it, I put part of it together, and it was a racial past, and in front of us in Point Breeze is a racial present. It's really
Right.
there. So
And
they
that
came
echo.
together.
And you say that wonderful thing, Beverly, let me quote, history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes. It happens again with a slightly different rhythm or pattern, but it isn't exactly the same, but it does repeat itself, unless we get wise enough to not
Unless
let that
we remember.
happen. Unless we remember, right? Remember.
It's very hard to remember.
And of course, you did enrich the current racial issue with some very profound understandings. I thought this was wonderful. Racists who read your book are going to be grabbed by this. People who are happy and satisfied in themselves and whole and honorable and whatever are not racist. People are racist who are embittered. The word you use, I think, is what? Galled.
Well, Glover meets one of his neighbors and has a kind of insight that the man is kind of frustrated and that racism is coming out of a kind of galled inability for a middle-class, upwardly mobile man to come to terms with what's happening in his life, and there's a target next door. And I don't know that this is always how it happens, but it feels to me real.
It does.
That one's racism can emerge out of feelings of jealousy and personal frustration.
Right, exactly.
When one's own life is not falling into place. And this is the old man's insight, and it helps him come to terms with maybe what happened to his friend, that there was an unwillingness to change, an unwillingness and a fear of change that
and
produces.
he feels a certain guilt about that.
Yes.
Because he stood by
And
when the terrible things that happened to
and
Lucky
don't we
Apple.
all, in
Don't
some
we all?
ways,
Don't we
share
all?
that?
And didn't Lois, oh, that was another wonderful thing, talk about the racism of the past and the current racism. And in between, the father character, the Alzheimer's patient, we find out was a freedom marcher in the civil rights movement. What marvelous juxtapositions. I mean, it's just incredibly meaningful, you know, and that his memory is lost is a little bit like the bad remembers itself, but the good has sort of vanished. But your book is bringing it all back in a very important way. And I have to take 1 second to comment on Tom Glover's not only early racist tendencies, but his sexist tendencies, treatment of his wife, disappointment that his child is a daughter and the son had been lost, we find out too. You deal with that in a very, very lovely way. So your book is an incredible balance of the old and the new and the forever fundamentals that stay with it. Tell me, Beverly, what do you see yourself doing 5 years down the road?
5 years down the road? Well, I'm writing now, and I can't imagine stopping at this point. I'm enjoying now some skills I've developed. I'm working on another book, and
wonderful.
I have a book in mind after that, so I think I have some
You'll be writing away, and we'll be reading away, and we are privileged to have had you talk about the book with us.
Thanks so much.
I think someday when honors were appropriately heaped upon you, I'll be especially proud to say she was on my program after that book, In Troubled Waters, Beverly Coyle. Thank you for being here. Thank you, dear audience, for being there. This is Florence Rapoport saying good night this night. Happy to have provided you with this wonderful opportunity, this wonderful writer, and a chance to read a wonderful book. Thank you for being there. This is Florence Rapoport. I said that already. Good night this night, and looking forward to seeing you on our next night.